The house was quiet, too quiet for Samantha's liking. It was a large, sprawling property that her husband, David, had insisted they buy a few years ago, a symbol of his success as a businessman. Samantha admired his drive and ambition, but sometimes she felt like just another possession in his collection. She remembered when the house used to be filled with laughter, with moments that felt warm and close. Now it was only a shell of what their life had once been. David's career had taken on a life of its own, swallowing up most of his time and energy. Samantha knew he was providing a good life for them, and she'd always been supportive of his ambitions. But over the years, their conversations had dwindled to quick updates or logistical questions. On the few nights he'd come home before midnight, David would quickly shower, eat a late dinner in silence, and then fall asleep before Samantha had a chance to say much of anything. It was during one of those silent dinners that she felt the full weight of her loneliness. She watched David from across the table, hoping he might look up and notice the way her hand lingered near his, just a small sign that she was still there, still waiting. But his focus was glued to his phone, lost in the endless emails and calls that dominated his life. As the days passed, Samantha began to feel the emptiness more acutely. It wasn't just about David not being around, it was about the loss of connection, of intimacy. Nights became the hardest, with the once vibrant home now filled with only echoes and memories. She lay awake for hours, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, trying to remember the last time she'd felt truly seen by her husband. One morning, as Samantha prepared her coffee, she heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Her stepson, Ryan, had returned from college just in time for the summer. He was 24, tall and confident, with a bright smile and an easy charm that made everyone around him feel at ease. They hadn't seen each other much in the past few years, but Ryan's presence brought a different kind of energy to the house. One Samantha had forgotten she missed, Ryan and Samantha had always been friendly. She had entered his life when he was a teenager, and while they'd never been particularly close, there had always been a mutual respect. Now, seeing him as a grown man, she couldn't help but notice how much he'd changed. He was no longer the quiet, slightly awkward teenager she remembered. He had grown into a thoughtful, charismatic man. He often helped her around the house, chatting with her in a way that David never did. The casual exchanges and laughter they shared reminded her of a time when things were simpler, when the house felt like a home. One evening, after another long day of silence, Samantha found herself in the living room with Ryan. He had just come back from a run, his face flushed, a light sweat on his brow. He grabbed a water bottle and flopped down on the couch, stretching out in that relaxed way that only young people could manage. Samantha smiled, amused by his carefree attitude. "Long day?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. She nodded, surprised at how easily he seemed to read her mood. "Just long," she replied, unable to fully articulate the weight she was feeling. He looked at her thoughtfully. "I get it. College was tough, too. Sometimes it felt like I was living on autopilot, you know?" Samantha laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised her. "Yes, exactly like that," she said, relieved that someone else seemed to understand. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, a comfortable one, before Ryan turned to her, his gaze lingering just a little too long. She felt a strange warmth under his look, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Quickly, she brushed it off, telling herself it was just the result of her own isolation. But as the days turned into weeks, Samantha began to notice subtle changes in their interactions. She found herself looking forward to the moment she'd run into Ryan in the kitchen or the living room. His smile was contagious, his laughter refreshing. She could feel herself being drawn to him, not in any overt way, but in a subtle, almost innocent yearning for companionship. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the living room, she noticed Ryan watching her from the doorway. She looked up, slightly startled to see him there. His gaze was steady, curious, and there was a small, almost playful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Need any help? He asked, stepping forward. Oh no, I've got it, she said, trying to keep her tone light. But her heart was racing, a strange sensation creeping up her spine. They spent the next hour cleaning and talking, their conversation wandering from Ryan's college days to Samantha's own memories of her youth. It was easy natural, and for the first time in a long while, Samantha felt like she was connecting with someone. She felt seen in a way that David hadn't made her feel in years. That night, as she lay in bed alone, Samantha found her thoughts drifting to Ryan. She tried to push the thoughts away, scolding herself for being foolish, but the memories lingered, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his gaze. She turned over, pulling the blanket up to her chin, telling herself it was just the loneliness talking, just a fleeting distraction. Days passed, but the connection between them only seemed to grow stronger. Ryan began spending more time around the house, always finding small excuses to be near her. He'd help with the dishes, keep her company as she cooked, even join her for a movie every now and then. Their conversations grew deeper, sometimes drifting into topics she hadn't discussed with anyone in years. Samantha knew she was on dangerous ground, but part of her felt alive, felt like she was finally breaking free of the suffocating emptiness that had surrounded her for so long. She began to dress a little differently, taking more care with her appearance. She told herself it was just for her own confidence, but deep down, she knew it was for Ryan. One evening, Samantha was in her bedroom, trying on a dress she hadn't worn in years. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting the fabric, wondering if she still looked desirable, if she could still catch someone's eye. A knock on the door startled her, and before she could respond, the door opened slightly. It was Ryan, his face a mix of embarrassment and surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." He stammered, his gaze flickering between her and the floor. She wrapped a robe around herself, trying to hide the blush creeping up her cheeks. "It's fine," she said, her voice softer than she intended. They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence hanging between them, both unsure of what to say. In that brief moment, Samantha felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. The awareness of him standing so close, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, it was electrifying. But as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Ryan mumbled an apology and quickly left the room, leaving Samantha alone with her racing thoughts. That night, as she lay in bed, Samantha couldn't shake the image of Ryan's surprised, slightly captivated expression. She knew that this was dangerous, that even entertaining the thought of him was a step too far. But in the quiet darkness of her room, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be held, to be desired, to be seen. In the following weeks, Samantha found herself grappling with an inner turmoil she hadn't anticipated. She was drawn to Ryan in ways that were both unexpected and unsettling. Each day, her emotions grew more complicated as she struggled to balance the lingering sense of responsibility she felt as his stepmother with the undeniable connection they shared. Despite her attempts to focus on her marriage and push thoughts of Ryan away, her loneliness had become too entrenched, and the rift with her husband too wide to ignore. David, as usual, remained oblivious to her struggle. His schedule only grew busier, filled with business trips, late meetings, and endless phone calls. Samantha began to feel like a ghost in her own home, existing in the spaces between his commitments. The dinners they shared were strained and silent, each one another reminder of the intimacy that had slipped away from their lives. More often than not, he would excuse himself midway through the meal to take a call or finish an urgent email, leaving her to eat alone. One night, after a particularly empty evening with David, Samantha wandered downstairs to find Ryan sitting in the kitchen, headphones on, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone, absent-mindedly scrolling on. She hesitated at the doorway, torn between joining him and heading back to the solitude of her room. But before she could decide, Ryan looked up and noticed her. He took off his headphones, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice gentle. Samantha shrugged, suddenly feeling shy. "Something like that," she replied, trying to sound casual. She walked over to the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and joined him at the table. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment before Ryan spoke again. "It's hard to relax around here, isn't it? Dad's always working, and you seem like you're always on your own," he said, watching her closely. His observation startled her. No one had ever put her feelings into words quite so directly. She nodded, feeling vulnerable under his gaze. "Yes, I suppose it's been that way for a while now." It just it just gets lonely sometimes, she admitted. Surprised at her own honesty, Ryan reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "I'm here, if you ever need someone to talk to," he said softly. Her heart quickened at the contact, but she forced herself to remain calm. She didn't pull her hand away, allowing the moment to linger. There was a gentleness to Ryan that felt grounding, a reassurance she hadn't felt in Egypt. But as comforting as his words were, they also stirred something deeper within her, a longing that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself over the next few days. Samantha's interactions with Ryan became more frequent, and she found herself seeking out his company, looking forward to their shared moments. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything from books to travel to music. Their conversations felt natural, flowing easily in a way that her exchanges with David no longer did, but each interaction left her with a mixture of emotions, relief, excitement, and a creeping sense of guilt. She knew this bond was crossing boundaries that couldn't easily be undone. Yet, the more time she spent with Ryan, the more she realized how much she had been starved for affection and companionship. In his presence, she felt valued, seen, and understood in ways that she had missed for so long. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samantha felt a familiar ache of loneliness swell in her chest. She took a deep breath, attempting to steady herself, but Ryan noticed her change in demeanor. He turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked. His voice soft. Samantha hesitated, debating whether she should tell him the truth. But the weight of her emotions was too much to carry alone. She nodded slowly, finally allowing her guard to drop. I just, I don't know how I ended up here feeling so alone in my own marriage," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan reached over and gently touched her shoulder, his expression sincere. "You don't deserve to feel that way, Samantha," he said, his tone serious. "I know it's not my place, but I can see how much you're hurting. It's hard to watch someone like you feel so undervalued." Her heart ached at his words, and she felt a surge of warmth for him, a gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you, Ryan," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "It means a lot to hear that." I didn't realize how much I needed someone to say that. They held each other's gaze for a moment, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. She felt as if Ryan understood her pain in a way no one else could, as if he had the power to lift the loneliness she had been carrying for so long. The air between them was charged with an intensity she couldn't ignore, and in that moment, the boundaries she had clung to felt dangerously thin. But Samantha wasn't the only one struggling with conflicting feelings. Ryan found himself increasingly drawn to her, torn between respect for his father and a desire to be close to Samantha. He admired her strength and resilience, and he could see the toll that her strained marriage had taken on her. It was becoming harder for him to separate his feelings of compassion from the growing attraction he felt for her. One afternoon, as Samantha prepared lunch, Ryan entered the kitchen and offered to help. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized as if they had been doing this together for years. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same ingredient, and they both froze, caught off guard by the simple yet intimate touch. Samantha looked up, meeting Ryan's gaze. His expression was unreadable, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite define. She felt her heart skip a beat, a wave of heat rising to her cheek. But instead of pulling away, she allowed herself to remain in that moment, savoring the warmth of his hand against hers. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that had been building for weeks. For the first time, Samantha felt as if she was teetering on the edge of something profound, something forbidden. Her mind told her to step back, to protect herself from crossing a line she could never uncross. But her heart ached for connection, for a closeness she hadn't felt in years. Later that night, as she lay awake in bed, Samantha replayed the day's events in her mind. She knew she was playing with fire, that her feelings for Ryan were crossing into dangerous territory, but the ache of her loneliness was too real, too raw to simply ignore. She tried to rationalize her emotions, convincing herself that this was just a phase, a temporary escape from her marriage's shortcomings. Yet deep down, she knew this was more than a fleeting distraction. Over the next week, Samantha tried to keep her distance from Ryan, hoping that a bit of space would quell the emotions stirring within her. But fate seemed to conspire against her as their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Each interaction, each glance and touch only served to heighten the tension between them, building up an undercurrent of desire that was growing impossible to ignore. One evening, as Samantha prepared to go to bed, she heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. She heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. Startled, she opened it to find Ryan standing there, his expression tentative. "I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, torn between inviting him in and sending him away, but the sight of him standing there looking vulnerable and sincere made her heart ache in a way that was impossible to resist. She opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. They sat together on the edge of her bed, both unsure of what to say. The silence was filled with an intensity that neither of them could deny. Finally, Ryan broke the stillness, his voice barely audible. "I know this is complicated, Samantha, but I can't ignore what I feel." Samantha's heart raced as his words hung in the air, their meaning clear and powerful. She knew she should stop him, tell him to leave, and end this before it went any further. But instead, she found herself reaching for his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I feel it too, Ryan," she whispered, the confession both terrifying and liberating. They sat there caught between what they knew was right and the undeniable pull between them. In that moment, all of the emotions they had been suppressing came rushing to the surface, each one more powerful than the last. They knew they were standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything, a line that once crossed could never be undone. After the confession that night, Samantha felt as if a dam had broken inside her. The boundary she had so carefully maintained between herself and Ryan now felt more like a thin veil, easily swept aside. They had crossed an emotional threshold, and the connection between them had only intensified, pulling them further into an uncharted territory they both knew was forbidden but irresistible. The following days were filled with an unspoken tension. Samantha tried to maintain her composure around Ryan, but every glance, every brush of his hand against hers sent a thrill through her that she couldn't ignore. She was living in a constant state of heightened awareness, hyper attuned to his presence and every small interaction. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, while David was away on a business trip, Samantha found herself in the kitchen preparing lunch. She had almost convinced herself that the feelings between her and Ryan were manageable, that she could keep them under control. But as Ryan walked in, the air thickened immediately. He moved to help her, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth radiating beside her. Their arms brushed as they reached for the same utensil, and she felt her resolve falter. They exchanged a brief glance, but this time neither of them looked away. Their eyes held, and the intensity between them deepened. Samantha's heart raced as she became acutely aware of his closeness, of the faint smell of his cologne, and the way his fingers lingered on her arm. "Are you okay?" Ryan's voice was soft, filled with concern and something else, a tenderness that was becoming harder to resist. She nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, he reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It was a simple gesture, but it felt intimate, almost possessive, and it ignited something inside her that she could no longer ignore. She felt her breath hit, her pulse quickening as he leaned in just slightly, his gaze locked onto hers. Samantha knew she should step back, break the moment before it went too far. But the loneliness she had felt for so long, coupled with the desire building between them, was overpowering. She couldn't pull away, not now, not when she felt so alive for the first time in years. Without another word, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the waters. But the initial hesitation quickly dissolved, and the kiss deepened, growing urgent, filled with months of suppressed feelings and unspoken words. She felt his arms wrap around her, pulling her closer, and she melted into his embrace, surrendering to the moment. They broke apart only when they heard a sound from the hallway. Panic flashed across Samantha's face, and they both stepped back, trying to compose themselves. It was only the sound of the air conditioning kicking in, but it served as a stark reminder of the risk they were taking. They exchanged a look, both of them breathless, their eyes mirroring a mix of exhilaration and fear. From that moment on, their encounters became more frequent, more charged with the thrill of secrecy. They would steal moments together whenever they could, a lingering touch as they passed each other in the hallway, whispered words in quiet corners of the house, stolen kisses behind closed doors. Each interaction added to the tension, pulling them deeper into a web of emotions that felt inescapable. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Ryan reached over, taking her hand in his. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said softly, his voice filled with both certainty and vulnerability. "I care about you, Samantha, more than I ever thought I could." Samantha's heart pounded as she met his gaze, her own feelings mirroring his. "I care about you too," she whispered, barely able to contain the surge of emotions within her. She knew the risks, the consequences that loomed if they continued down this path, but in that moment, all she could think about was the way he made her feel, valued, understood. Desired moments became a lifeline for Samantha, a refuge from the loneliness and neglect she felt in her marriage. She found herself looking forward to every stolen glance, every touch, and every conversation with Ryan. He made her feel alive, rekindling a spark she thought had long since faded. One evening, while David was away, Ryan invited her to join him on a drive. It was spontaneous, almost reckless, but Samantha felt a thrill at the idea of escaping, even if just for a little while. They drove out to a quiet overlook, where the city lights spread out beneath them in a blanket of shimmering colors. The view was breathtaking, But Samantha was more captivated by the warmth of Ryan's presence beside her. They sat together in the silence, both of them aware of the weight of the moment. Finally, Ryan reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. She leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes and letting herself feel the comfort of his touch. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. She felt safe, cherished, and for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. As the evening stretched on, they spoke in hushed tones, sharing their dreams, their fears, and the things they couldn't tell anyone else. For Samantha, it was a moment of profound connection, a glimpse into a life that felt real and full, unburdened by the constraints of her marriage. She knew it couldn't last, that the world they had created was fragile and temporary. But in that moment, it was all she needed. The drive back was quiet, both of them lost in thought, knowing that the night had changed something between them. They had crossed yet another line, one that made their connection feel less like an escape and more like a choice. Samantha knew that she was now on a path she couldn't easily turn back from, and the weight of that realization settled over her as they pulled into the driveway. In the days that followed, their encounters grew more intense, their connection deeper. They would meet in secret places around the house, sharing moments filled with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Their stolen kisses turned into embraces that lingered longer than they should have, and each touch left Samantha craving more. But as their relationship deepened, so did the risk. Samantha began to feel the weight of what they were doing, the fear of discovery gnawing at her even as she continued to seek out Ryan's presence. The thrill of their affair was tempered by the knowledge that they were walking a dangerous line, one that could destroy everything if they were caught. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Samantha voiced her fears. "What are we doing, Ryan? This can't last forever." "It's not sustainable," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and desperation. Ryan took her hands, his gaze steady. "I know it's complicated, Samantha, but I also know that I care about you more than I can explain. I don't have all the answers, but I know I don't want to lose what we have." His words sent a surge of warmth through her, but they did little to quell her fears. She knew they were entangled in something that defied easy solutions, something that was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Yet, despite the risks, she couldn't bring herself to let go. Her heart had already chosen, and the pull between them was too strong to resist. As they shared another lingering kiss, Samantha felt a sense of inevitability settle over her. She knew that the path they were on was fraught with danger, but she was too far gone to turn back. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and all she could see was the man before her, the one who had awakened something inside her that she couldn't ignore. Each passing day brought them closer to a precipice, the tension between them building to a fever pitch. Samantha knew that their secret couldn't remain hidden forever. Eventually, they would have to face the consequences of their choices. But in those stolen moments with Ryan, as they held each other close, all the worries and fears faded away, leaving only the thrill of the forbidden and the undeniable pull of their connection. They were two people caught in a whirlwind, drawn together by loneliness and longing, bound by an intensity that defied logic or reason. And as the days turned into nights and their encounters grew more passionate, Samantha found herself surrendering completely, embracing the dangerous, thrilling path they had chosen. As Samantha and Ryan continued down their treacherous path, the line between right and wrong became a mere shadow blurred by the intense emotions they shared. Their encounters grew riskier, their desire undeniable and consuming. But with each moment they stole together, Samantha could feel the pressure mounting, an impending sense of consequences closing in around them. The thrill of secrecy was beginning to be overtaken by the heavy weight of reality, and she sensed that they were nearing a breaking point. It happened one evening just after dinner. David had mentioned an out of town client meeting, so Samantha assumed he'd be away for the night. She and Ryan took the opportunity to spend time together openly, reveling in the freedom to laugh, talk, and even hold each other without fear of interruption. They felt liberated, even if it was temporary, indulging in an intimacy that had grown both exhilarating and necessary. As they sat close on the couch, hands intertwined, Samantha finally felt a fleeting sense of peace. Ryan leaned in, his gaze tender, and kissed her softly, as though savoring the moment. She relaxed into his arms, and for the first time, it felt like they were a real couple, free from the shadows and secrecy that had defined their relationship. But that fragile peace was shattered moments later by the sound of the front door opening. Panic gripped Samantha. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what was happening. David was supposed to be gone, wasn't he? She barely had time to react before David stepped into the living room, his eyes widening as he took in the scene before him. His wife and son sitting far too close, an air of intimacy hanging between them that was unmistakable. What's going on here? David's voice was sharp, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Samantha scrambled to her feet, her mind reckoned for an explanation. But nothing she could say would change what he had already seen. The truth hung in the air, as heavy and unavoidable as a storm. She could feel Ryan's hand slipping away from hers, and the reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. David, it's not, this isn't what it looks like, she stammered. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. David's gaze hardened, his disbelief turning into anger as he looked between them. And he still looked between them. "Isn't what it looks like," he echoed, his voice laced with contempt. "Then explain it to me, Samantha. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're both betraying me." Samantha felt the sting of his words and struggled to hold back her emotions. She knew there was no way to justify what she and Ryan had done, no explanation that would make sense. The truth was simple and devastating. She had fallen in love with Ryan, a connection that had bloomed in the emptiness David had left behind. As David's anger grew, so did Ryan's resolve. He stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Dad, it's not just her fault." "This is on me too," he said, his eyes filled with guilt and a determination to take responsibility for his actions. David's gaze turned on his son, and Samantha could see the betrayal and heartbreak etched into his expression. "I trusted you, both of you," he said, his voice breaking. "How could you do this to me? To us?" The confrontation that followed was brutal, with accusations and hurtful words flying back and forth, exposing wounds that could never truly heal. Samantha stood there, feeling her world crumble around her as David's words tore into her, each one a reminder of the life she had risked and the family she had destroyed. She tried to apologize, but her words felt empty, powerless against the devastation she had caused. After what felt like hours, David finally turned away, his face set in a mask of steely resolve. "I need some time to think," he said coldly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't look at either of you right now." With that, he left, slamming the door behind him, the echo of his departure reverberating through the empty house. Samantha sank onto the couch, her hands shaking as the full weight of her actions bore down on her. Ryan sat beside her, his own face pale with shock and guilt. They sat in silence, the gravity of what they had done settling over them like a heavy fog. Over the next few days, Samantha and Ryan tried to navigate the aftermath of the confrontation. David stayed away from the house, unreachable and silent, leaving them in a state of limbo. The guilt and shame weighed heavily on both of them, erasing the excitement and thrill they had once felt. Now, their relationship felt like a burden, something tainted by the pain they had caused. Samantha found herself questioning everything. She knew she cared deeply for Ryan, but she couldn't ignore the damage they had done. Every moment they shared was now overshadowed by guilt and the knowledge that they had hurt someone they both loved. She was haunted by the look on David's face, the betrayal in his eyes. She had wanted to feel alive to escape the loneliness of her marriage, but now she was left with an emptiness that felt even deeper than before. As the days passed, Samantha began to pull away from Ryan, the weight of their actions too much to bear. She knew that the relationship could never survive under these circumstances, that it was built on a foundation of secrecy and betrayal. She avoided him as much as possible, finding excuses to be alone, hoping that time and distance would help her make sense of the mess they had created. But Ryan wasn't willing to let go so easily. He confronted her one evening, his voice filled with desperation. Samantha, don't shut me out. I know this is hard, but we can find a way through it. We need to figure it out together. Samantha shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Ryan, don't you see? There's no way to fix this. We've crossed a line we can never uncross. I've hurt David, hurt our family, and now I don't even know who I am anymore. Ryan reached for her hand, his gaze pleading. We did this because we cared about each other, because we both needed something we weren't getting. That doesn't make it right, but it wasn't meaningless, Samantha. It wasn't just a mistake. His words resonated with her, but they also deepened her sorrow. She knew their connection was real, that it had brought her joy and comfort in a time when she had felt lost. But that didn't erase the consequences, the pain they had caused. She looked at him, her heart breaking as she spoke. Ryan, I don't regret the time we spent together. You made me feel things I thought I'd lost forever, but this isn't sustainable. It's tearing us apart. We have to end this for both our sakes, she said, her voice trembling. Ryan's face fell, and she could see the heartbreak in his eyes. But he nodded, understanding the truth of her words, even as it pained him to accept it. They sat in silence, the weight of their decision hanging between them like a final goodbye. A few days later, David returned, his demeanor distant and cold. He refused to speak to either of them directly, his anger and hurt palpable in every interaction. Samantha knew she had lost his trust, that no apology could ever mend the fracture between them. She felt as though she were living in a stranger's house, isolated and alone, haunted by the choices she had made. The final blow came one evening as David gathered his belongings and prepared to leave for an extended business trip. He looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. I don't know if I'll be back, Samantha, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. I need time to decide if this marriage is even worth saving. Samantha felt her heart shatter, but she forced herself to nod, understanding that she had driven him to this point. She had chosen a path that had led her to this moment, a path filled with passion but also betrayal, a path she could never retrace after David left. Samantha sat alone in the empty house, the silence oppressive. She had lost everything: her marriage, her relationship with Ryan, and the sense of stability she had once taken for granted. The thrill of her affair had faded, leaving only the hollow echo of the climax had passed, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions, to confront the wreckage of the life she had once known. She knew there was no easy path forward, that the journey ahead would be one of pain and healing, of rebuilding and reflection. But as she sat there, she resolved to face it, to own her choices and the heartbreak they had brought. She didn't know what the future held or if she could ever repair the damage she had done. But she was determined to try to find a way to rebuild her life, even if it meant starting from scratch. She would face the emptiness, the loneliness, and the grief, knowing that this was the price she had paid for a fleeting moment of passion. In the days following David's departure, Samantha found herself alone in the quiet, empty house. The silence felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the choices that had led her here. She had once craved solitude as a refuge from her loneliness, but now it felt like a punishment, a cold emptiness that filled every corner of her life. Her relationship with Ryan had ended, David had left without any assurances of return, and the family she had once been part of now felt like a distant memory. Samantha spent hours each day reflecting on the decisions she had made. The whirlwind of emotions and passion that had pulled her and Ryan together now felt like a distant echo, replaced by a deep sense of guilt and regret. She knew that she had crossed a line that could never be undone, and she was left to grapple with the consequences of her actions. The weight of her mistakes was heavy, but Samantha resolved to face it head on. She started taking small steps to rebuild her life, focusing on restoring a sense of normalcy. She threw herself into routines, organizing the house, cooking meals, and taking long walks to clear her mind. These small acts helped her regain a semblance of stability, a way to ground herself amidst the turmoil. One evening, she found herself in the living room looking through old photos. She came across pictures of her and David from the early days of their marriage, moments filled with joy and laughter, a time when they had been inseparable. Seeing those images brought a wave of bittersweet nostalgia, a reminder of the love they had once shared. She realized that despite everything, she still cared deeply for David, and the pain she had caused him weighed heavily on her heart. Feeling a surge of determination, Samantha decided to write David a letter. She poured her heart onto the pages, acknowledging her mistakes and the hurt she had caused, expressing her remorse and apologizing for the betrayal. She didn't ask for forgiveness, as she knew that was something he had to decide for himself. Instead, she simply wanted to let him know that she was taking responsibility for her actions and that she hoped, in time, he could find peace. In the letter, Samantha also expressed her desire to rebuild her life with honesty and integrity, regardless of whether or not David chose to return. She wanted him to understand that her affair with Ryan had been a painful wake up call, forcing her to confront the void in her life that she had been ignoring for so long. She acknowledged that their marriage had been struggling long before her relationship with Ryan, but she took full responsibility for her actions and the consequences they had brought. After sending the letter, Samantha felt a sense of relief. She knew it would take time for David to process everything, but she felt that she had taken an important step toward healing. Writing the letter allowed her to confront her own emotions, to lay bare the parts of herself she had been afraid to face. It was a painful process, but one that she knew was necessary if she was ever going to move forward. Meanwhile, Samantha avoided contact with Ryan. She knew that any attempt to reconnect would only reopen old wounds, preventing both of them from finding closure. She had come to understand that her relationship with Ryan had been rooted in her own insecurities and loneliness, a temporary escape from the reality of her marriage. She wished him well, hoping he could find peace and move on with his life, free from the weight of their past. As the weeks passed, Samantha began to feel a gradual sense of healing. She focused on rebuilding herself, exploring hobbies she had once enjoyed but had let go of in the years of her marriage. She started reading again, attended a yoga class, and even joined a local art group where she met new people. These small steps helped her reconnect with a part of herself that she had lost along the way. One afternoon, as she was tending to the garden, Samantha received an unexpected message from David. He was coming home for a weekend to discuss things. Her heart raced at the thought, a mixture of hope and fear surging within her. She didn't know what to expect, but she prepared herself for whatever conversation awaited. When David arrived, there was a palpable tension in the air. He looked weary, a hint of sadness in his eyes as he stepped into the house. Samantha could see that the time away had been difficult for him, and she felt a pang of guilt, knowing she was the reason for his pain. But she also sensed a quiet strength in him, a resolve that both comforted and frightened her. They sat down in the living room, the silence stretching between them before David finally spoke. I read your letter, he said, his voice steady but guarded. It was honest. I appreciate that. In time, Samantha came to realize that her greatest strength had been her ability to confront her own flaws and embrace the journey of self discovery. She had found a new sense of purpose, a way to live authentically, both in her marriage and within herself. Her path had been painful, but it had led her to a place of inner peace she had never thought possible. As she stood by David's side, looking forward to the future they were building together, Samantha felt a sense of gratitude for the journey she had taken. Not just the moments of love and reconciliation, but also the mistakes and lessons that had brought her to this point. She was no longer bound by her past, but guided by the resilience and strength she had gained along the way. In the end, Samantha learned that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, a commitment to grow, to forgive, and to build something lasting, even in the face of imperfection. And as she looked ahead, she felt ready to embrace the future, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had found within herself the strength to overcome them.